One of the most fascinating things to me about the Bible
is how full the Bible is of themes, repeated ideas and words and phrases that as we read through Scripture, Genesis to Revelation, we are meant to pick up on. We're meant to hear these themes and read them together in some way or understand them in some form of unity, some cohesion. That's sort of like a good movie, right? I don't know if y'all like good movies, but one of the things that makes good movies really good is the music in the background of the movie. And good movie music often has themes that are repeated, musical melodies, lines of music, notes that are repeated again and again at key moments in the film so that you know you've been here before. So that you know, I've heard this before and I need to pay attention. I could probably sing two notes and make everyone in the building think about a shark attack. And the reason I can do that is because the writer of that music knew what a good theme was. And every time you hear those two notes, you know what's coming. If you're watching one of the many Star Wars productions, you can hear the trombones start Darth Vader's theme, and you know what's about to come on screen. By the way, theme songs in movies aren't always obvious. Sometimes the themes are varied. Sometimes it uses different instruments that we don't expect to hear. Sometimes the key is changed or the mood of the theme is altered. Even so, good movies make you stop and think, I've heard this before. I've heard this before. And they make you know or anticipate or expect what's coming. The Bible is full of repeated themes, words, phrases, stories that pop up again and again and again. And sometimes the repetition is obvious to us. Sometimes the stories are so similar. Like in our Bible reading, if you just read Genesis this last week, you read 3 stories about Abraham twice and Isaac another time, walking into a foreign king's land and saying to his wife, "Tell them you're my sister." That was a theme. We heard that 3 times. It was a theme. Sometimes it's so obvious. They're so similar, or the wording is repeated exactly, and we just go, I know I've heard this. I know what's coming. Other times the repetition is less clear. It's similar, but subtly changed in some way. But when we're paying attention in our Bible reading, these repeated themes make us stop and think, I've read this before. I've been here before. This year, Lord willing, I'm going to be preaching a series about a biblical theme. And that theme is the priesthood. Priests play a big role in the Bible. It's one of those roles or one of those words or ideas that pops up again and again and again throughout the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. It's obvious that priests are important to God. We hear the theme loud and clear when Israel builds the tabernacle in the wilderness. And after constructing this tent, Moses is told to go consecrate Aaron and his sons. And there's this enormous ceremony where they kill animals and they're sprinkling blood all over the priests and their clothes and the tabernacle. And they're consecrating them and making them holy and offering these sacrifices. And there's a lot of biblical space devoted to introducing that theme because these priests are important to God. But this theme just keeps popping up time and time again throughout the Scriptures. Almost every time temple worship is mentioned, or something is happening to the temple, or they're repairing the temple, or the temple worship is being restored or even torn down, almost every time the priests are there, front and center, right or wrong. Sometimes the tone is happy, sometimes the tone is not happy in stories about priests. Priests are sometimes in the wrong in the Bible. They lead people astray. They don't teach them the law like they're supposed to. Sometimes the notes of these themes are very faint. Sometimes there are characters who are not priests, but do priestly things. Sometimes there are kings who offer sacrifices. You say, why is Saul doing that? I've heard this story before. I know about people who offer sacrifices, but why is Saul doing it? It's the same theme. It's subtly changed, but it makes us go, I've heard this before. Then, of course, the New Testament revisits the theme again by announcing that Jesus is the superior high priest. It pops up throughout Scripture. But before we can dive into this theme and work to understand it, we need to take a step back and try to answer this question first. What is a priest? The word priest is a word that outside of a study of the Old Testament, we don't use that often. At least not here in this church. Outside of a study of the Old Testament or Aaron's descendants, we don't often talk about priests. Our church here doesn't have a special class of leadership that we call priests. And by the way, I hope that as the series progresses, we'll be able to address why that is. Many of you probably have in your minds something about Aaron, the high priest, and his sons dressed up in their special clothes, killing animals in the tabernacle. When I say priest, my guess is that that's what most of you are thinking. I know about those priests. I know about the Old Testament priesthood, the Israelites and their priests. And that's a biblical image. That's great. There are plenty of people, though, who hear the word priest and imagine modern ideas, modern renditions of a priesthood. For instance, modern Catholics, people who are of the Orthodox faith or Anglicans, they have priests who serve in their church, in their hierarchies. There are priests that they describe. Broadly speaking, other religions in the world around us have priests. Hinduism has priests. Buddhists have priests. Despite all of this, I'm not sure how well we understand what a priest is. What was the role of Aaron in the Old Testament? What were those people doing in the tabernacle, in the temple, day after day? How is that related, if at all, to what the Catholic priesthood does? Or the priesthood of other religions? Are they related? They're using the same terminology. They're using the same words. Is there any relationship to what they're doing and what we see around us today in various religions or denominations? We need to talk about that for just a minute this morning. And I hope this isn't boring to you. It's certainly not to me. But to really understand what a priest is, we have to understand something about the ancient world. And so, as I know you often do on Sunday mornings, you woke up thinking, boy, I hope he does ancient history. Here we go. The first time the word priest is used in the Bible is in Genesis chapter 14, verse 18. The first time we know anything about any priest in the Bible is Genesis chapter 14, verse 18. And this is what the text says. Genesis 14, verse 18. It says, "And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High." This is from that obscure story in Genesis where Abram saves Lot from a war that was going on between several city-state kings. All of these kings, I think there's like 7, 8, 9 of them, something like that. All of these kings from these various cities in Canaan had decided to go to war with one another, and Lot, Abram's nephew, was caught up in the middle of it all, and Abram actually went in and sort of extradited him. He took him out and said, protected him, he saved him. And afterwards, this king named Melchizedek, who wasn't involved in the war, by the way, but this king named Melchizedek comes along, honors Abram, and we never hear from him again in the narrative. We hear about him again in the Bible, but he doesn't pop up again. He just sort of pops onto the scene in Genesis 14, blesses Abram, and leaves. Now, there are a lot of interesting things about this story. And again, I hope that in a future lesson we'll be able to talk more about Melchizedek. But for our purposes, I just want you to notice this. In Genesis chapter 14 and verse 18, I just want you to notice that, that Melchizedek is described as a priest of God Most High. And that's it. There's no mention about what a priest is. There's no definition for us about what that means. There's no description of what Melchizedek does in his role as a priest of God Most High. Just the simple acknowledgement that Melchizedek was a priest of God. Do you know why the writer of Genesis can just sort of throw that fact out without any sort of explanation? Do you know why that is? The writer of Genesis can do that because the ancient world was full of priests. They were everywhere. Every culture had priests. Every society, every city had priests. Everyone knew what priests were and what they did. If you were one of the very first readers who were reading the book of Genesis way back thousands of years ago, and you started reading it and you read that Melchizedek was a priest, you would have said, yeah, I know what that is. I see them all the time in my city. They're everywhere. And by the way, priests weren't just everywhere in the ancient world. They were ingrained in the very fabric of what society was all about. They were so ingrained in society that it wasn't just a matter of, yeah, I happen to know a priest. It was, priests are crucial to our everyday life. So we need to be let in on a little bit on what ancient people knew so well. What exactly did priests do in the ancient world? What was their job? What was their function? What is a priest? Now, what I'm about to say is painted with a very broad brush. Societies were different. Cultures were different. The Egyptians were different than the Mesopotamians. They were different than the Canaanites. But there are some common themes that start to reveal themselves when we look at how people as a whole viewed priests in the ancient world. Ancient people, especially those who existed in and around the Bible lands. We're talking about the lands of Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, ancient Canaan. Ancient people were polytheistic. They believed in a whole host of gods. And they believed in this array of gods who manipulated every aspect of society. The belief in the ancient world was that the gods were many and every god had some hand in what was happening in the world below. Some gods were more powerful than others. Some gods were thought to be more influential than others. Some gods were believed to be local, just over a particular location. There were a host of different kinds of gods, but the overarching idea was simple. If we, as ancient people, want life to go well for us, if we want our crops to grow, if we want to lead healthy lives, if we want military success, then we need to make sure that the gods are on our side. That's the way ancient people lived their life. That's where ancient priests come into the picture. Ancient priests served the gods on behalf of the people, and especially on behalf of the king. You see, every god in the ancient world had a temple, a place where his image and his essence resided as a marker that he was the god over that location, that he was the one who ruled over this city or this area of the world or this nation. They built these temples all over the ancient world to house the gods. And in many ancient cultures, it was the king who was closest to the gods. They would say the king was the one who had the closest relationship to the gods. In fact, some kings in Egypt even got to the point where they claimed themselves to be gods or descendants of the gods. But the king couldn't possibly appease every god in every temple, in every city all the time. The king couldn't be everywhere at once to give the gods what they wanted or to talk to the gods on behalf of the people. So in many of these ancient cultures, the kings would appoint priests to be representatives of the king before the gods. The king couldn't go in every single temple, but he could appoint priests who could go and represent him before the gods. The priests then were tasked with a few jobs in the ancient world. The priests were tasked with caring for the image and the temple of the gods. Perhaps even living on site to attend to the god's every need. If the god needed new clothes to wear, the priest would be the one inside dressing the idol. If the gods needed food to eat, it was the ancient priests that would go in and offer the sacrifice and feed the statue in the temple. These idols and statues were not believed to just be decorations by the ancient people. They were dressed, they were fed, they were cared for in every way that a human would be, and it was the job of the priests to do that. And the gods were easily angered. And so it was important that you have a priest that knows how to appease the gods. Because if the gods are angry with us, the ancient people would have believed in Mesopotamia and Egypt, if the gods are angry with us, then they won't let our crops grow. They'll flood the Nile River and our crops will be destroyed, or we won't be able to bear children to work for us and our family and so forth. The gods were so instrumental in what every aspect of their life was. And because the gods were so easily angered, we needed a professional who knew how to appease them. That was very important in the ancient mind. If crops didn't do well, it may be that the gods were angry. So let's go feed them a sacrifice. The priests would feed the gods for you. They would represent you as they went in and tended to the gods' needs. Ancient priests, at the most basic level, were mediators. They stood between the gods and humanity. They knew what the gods wanted, and they knew how to care for the gods' needs. They knew how to perform the rituals just right so that the gods would be happy. If you needed access to a god in the ancient world, you would go find a priest to guide you through that process. And so they were mediators. Or perhaps I think I like this word better, and I've already used this word. They were representatives. They would represent the people before the gods, and they would represent the gods before the people. And so when Genesis 14 verse 18 comes along and you're reading through your daily Bible reading and you come across this obscure story and the text says, Melchizedek, the king of Salem, was a priest of God Most High, there's no doubt in anyone's mind what is being said there. Melchizedek is a representative of Yahweh. There's no question about that. Nobody reading that would have any doubt. They would say, oh, I know what his job is. I know what he does. He's the guy that knows how to communicate with Yahweh. He's the one who knows how to mediate to Yahweh. And when Melchizedek blesses Abram in Genesis 14, it's a blessing not from Melchizedek, but it's understood because he's a priest of God Most High that his blessing comes from God Most High. It's a blessing from the Most High God who is served in the city of Salem. This wouldn't be strange in the ancient world. But it's the first explicit statement that we have in the Bible that confirms that Yahweh, the God who is greater by far than any other deity that anyone else has ever even dreamed of worshiping, that God, the creator of the heavens and the earth, that Yahweh has priests. This is the first confirmation of that. Yahweh has priests. And that's interesting. To stop and recognize that, yes, the Israelites and Abram before them and all of God's people in the Old Testament, they exist in a culture that is inundated with priests. Every God has priests. Every culture has priests. Everyone knows priests. But Yahweh has priests too. Yahweh has people who serve him. Yahweh has people who wait on him, who represent him to the world, and who can represent humanity to him. Our task in the lessons ahead this year is to learn about these priests. Who are Yahweh's priests? And to learn about them in their various roles and their various contexts. Because we might have in our minds that, yes, of course Yahweh has priests. It's Aaron and his sons. And that's true. Those are priests of Yahweh. But so is Melchizedek. There are other priests of Yahweh. Who are these people? We've heard this sound before. We've read these stories before. Before we can do that, I want to offer you some big picture insight into what kinds of things Yahweh's priests do. I'm making a distinction here, by the way. I'm not talking here specifically about Israel's priests. I'm not talking specifically about Aaron's priesthood. I'm talking broadly about anyone in the Bible who serves the role, who fits the pattern, who follows the theme as a priest of Yahweh. And there are a lot of them. What kind of things are we going to find these priests doing? Just to get us started, Yahweh's priests communicate Yahweh's expectations to humanity. They communicate God's will, His law, His desires to humans. And there's a lot of people who do that in the Bible. In fact, that's part of what Moses does. Moses, before the Aaronic priesthood, before Aaron becomes the high priest and his children after him serve as priests, Aaron acts as the priest for Israel, the mediator between God and humanity. Moses goes into the tent of meeting to inquire of the Lord, to ask God questions, and then to communicate those needs to Yahweh. Balaam petitions Yahweh for Israel's destruction on behalf of Balak, king of Moab. That's a priestly function. The king of Moab, Balak, would come to Balaam and say, I want the gods to kill Israel. And Balaam says, okay, I'll go take your needs before the gods. The high priest who carries the sacrifice for Israel's atonement into the presence of Yahweh for their forgiveness every year is taking the needs of humanity to the gods, or to Yahweh in that case. Yahweh's priests are mediators and representatives. They take the people's needs and questions to Yahweh. I think I might have said this wrong initially. I think I'm getting these mixed up. They take humanity's needs before God, and now they take God's will, instructions, and law to humanity. They do both. They're mediators. They're intermediaries. They're representatives. In this case, Melchizedek spoke Yahweh's blessings to Abraham. He was giving Abram the words of Yahweh, the blessing of Yahweh. The high priests do this as well. Aaron's high priesthood would use the Urim and the Thummim to relay God's will to the people when asked. The Levites were supposed to teach Israel's law, the law of Yahweh to them. And so the priests of Yahweh are also mediators and representatives in the other direction. Yes, they communicate humanity's needs to Yahweh, but they also communicate Yahweh's desires and expectations to humanity. Just in summary fashion, I want to share one more thing that becomes significant in Scripture that Yahweh's priests do, and that is that Yahweh's priests are caretakers of Yahweh's holy space. This is a big idea, and I probably should have left more time to develop, but I hope that we'll be able to do that in the months ahead. The Bible describes places where Yahweh's presence is tangibly felt. Most notably, that's the temple, right? In fact, God fills the temple with His glory after Solomon prays at the end of its construction. The same thing happens with Moses and the tabernacle. When Moses dedicates the tabernacle to Yahweh's service, His glory fills the tabernacle in a tangible and a real way. But that's not the only places that God's space is felt tangibly by His people. The Garden of Eden is a place where God dwells tangibly with His creation. Bethel is a place in our Bible reading in Genesis. I don't know if you noticed how often God revealed Himself to people at Bethel. So often did He reveal Himself at Bethel that Jacob said, I'm going to call this place Bethel, the house of God. It says God lives here. Mount Sinai is God's space. It's a place where God comes tangibly and talks to His people. Even the city of Jerusalem itself. And there are others. But wherever Yahweh's presence is felt, there is a need for priests to work in God's space. There's a need for priests to work around God's things. They are to care for it, to keep it up, to tend to its needs, to repair it, to grow it, to fill it with worship. Priests are always to be found in God's holy space because one of their primary roles is to care for God's things. I imagine there's a lot more to say, but we're just getting started in our new year. And in our study of this theme, as we try to go throughout the Bible and pick up echoes of this theme as we read and as we study. But I hope that this has begun the process of peeling back any complicated layers of confusion surrounding this topic. The ancient concept of a priest was far from uniform, but if there is a basic idea throughout the cultures, it is this. Priests are representatives. They stand between the gods and humanity to keep everyone happy. That was the ancient perception of a priesthood. And there are plenty of differences between the priests of the nations and the priests of Yahweh, but the basic role remains the same. Yahweh's priests are mediators who work in God's space. I want to end this lesson by turning to the book of Hebrews. This has been a lot of sort of history and just trying to ground ourselves in a common understanding of what a priest even is. But I want to just read before we close from Hebrews chapter 7. This is a text about Jesus. It's one that you might be familiar with. It's a text about Jesus, and it's one that we'll return to at the end of our study, Lord willing, in December as we draw the year to a close. But I want you to listen to the words of the New Testament as it relates to a priesthood, specifically the priesthood of Jesus. This is Hebrews chapter 7, beginning in verse 26. For it was fitting for us to have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens, who does not need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people, because this he did once for all, when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son, made perfect forever. Now the main point in what has been said is this: we have such a high priest, who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary and in the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched not for man. For every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, so it is necessary that this high priest also have something to offer. That's a text about Jesus and the priesthood that Jesus inaugurates. What I want you to know today is this: there is a priest of Yahweh even today. We don't live in a society or a culture or a world that is as inundated with priests as it once was, but Yahweh still has his priests. But the priest of Yahweh today, who mediates for us today, is not a mediator or a priest in an imperfect way, as if he might make mistakes and anger the gods. That was always the fear in the ancient world. We might do it wrong, and then the gods won't give us the crops. We don't have that worry, the Hebrews writer says. It's not as if this priest is going to offer sacrifice or mediate towards God in an imperfect way that he might make a mistake or anger the gods. That's not it at all. And it is not in a partial way, as if he just keeps up a makeshift tent or built a building to house some image of God. No. Jesus represents humanity in the very throne room of God. He mediates on our behalf, communicating our needs to God, to Yahweh. He communicates God's expectations to us. And he does so in the very space of God, not in some representation of God's space, not in some partial place of God's holy space, but in the presence of God at the right hand of his throne. Jesus makes it possible for us to live at peace with the Most High God because he is a perfect priest. And that's where we're going to try to get over the course of this series. What do we learn from the Old Testament about these priests that pop up time and time again? And what does that teach us about Jesus and how we relate to the one true God today? Are you at peace with the Most High God? Do you have a relationship with him through his Son, Jesus the Christ? If you need help with that, we want to pause in our worship right now and have an opportunity to help you enter into a relationship with him through his perfect representation, his perfect mediation as the perfect high priest. If there's some way we can help you, you're welcome to come now as we stand and as we sing this song of encouragement.